Yep, I see your screen. We're ready.
Very good. Very good. There we go. That's the whole screen, right?
Yes, you can see the whole screen.
Now we're recorded. Let us begin. Once again, I introduce myself. Wapski Minister Mr. Tem Disnakas, Juni do Dem, Iskonaning Donji. Nishnawbe so Tuni. I am originally from Scullin First Nations of Treaty 2 territory. My name is Alan Sutherland. That's my colonial name. This is session 5 of the Nishnawbe virtual history of the Great Migration 2. So it extends from our last session. This one is starting to introduce more of European contact via the fur trade. I'll start off again about the history in the heart of Turtle Island, which is where we are. By 2500 before present, the warm and dry climate of Central North America was changing again. Rainfall was more abundant, summer were cooler and shorter, and more snow fell during the longer winter months. The boreal forest expanded southward and westward, displacing the flora and fauna of the grasslands. The bison and the communities that hunted it were in turn pushed to the south and west. In their place, woodland peoples from the upper Great Lakes moved into southern Manitoba. Diagnostic projectile points suggest that there were 3, possibly maybe 4 different groups that were present at the Forks during the archaic period between 3 and 2200 before present. Now, the stone from which these tools were made would come from sources in Manitoba, North Dakota, Lake Superior region, and Texas. These environmental and demographic shifts were reflected in cultural innovations. For instance, ceramics were introduced to the Manitoba region around 2000 before present by a population from Eastern Forest. At the Forks, which we'll be talking more and more as we go on through the presentations, large quantities of fish remains have been found in associations to these woodland period occupants, suggesting that fishing was the major portion of the economy. The Forks may well have been the meeting place of eastern forest dwellers, bison hunters of the Western Plains, each of whom possessed resources for trade, technologies, and customs to share. Investigations into the Red River Valley, such as in Lockport and St. Agathe, providing evidence that plains and boreal cultures were present at various times during the past 2,000 years. The introduction of pottery to Manitoba 2,000 years ago marked the advent of woodland period. At the Forks, distinctive expressions of Avonlea, referred to as the Brett phase, were recovered near the Travel Manitoba building that is situated at the Forks. It is dated about 1450 before present. Across the site, there were multiple occupations by people associated with distinctive ceramic style known today as the Black Duck peoples. This was around 13 to 1,000 before present. They were followed by people associated with unique variation of ceramic styles from the Rainy River area. During this period, game populations were redistributing themselves in response to a warming trend in mid-continental North America. This in turn prompted human communities to relocate, resulting in conflicts over land use and access to resources are to believe had precipitated a major peace meeting between 9 nations, which oral traditions suggest was held at the Forks about 736 years before present. The range of cultural groups present were such a broad area of the continent at this time supports this assertion. Now, agriculture was the most dramatic innovation of the woodland period. During the 11th and 12th centuries, the population of farming communities in the regions such as Manitoba grew considerably. A period of severe drought ended this period of growth rather than abruptly, and prompting a major population disbursement, including some migrations northward to the lower Red River Valley. Evacuations of the Lockport and north of Winnipeg have found charred corn kernels, blades made from a bison underground storage bins and pottery styles commonly found in upper Midwestern United States. These dates from the 15th century are the earliest evidence of cultivation, harvesting, and consumption of domestic plant foods on the Canadian plains, such as corn. There is evidence of several cultural groups from wide area being present at the forks prior to the 1700s. This evidence may represent a meeting of the Anishinaabeg peoples in what are today is central and southern Manitoba, northwestern Ontario, northwestern Minnesota, and possibly parts of Minnesota, North Dakota, along the Red River Valley. And this is from the continue on from the Anishinaabeg migration from the east into the west. And I'll pick it up in 1653. Now the French Corps de Bras were the demise of the Huron by the Iroquois nations, moved in to become the middlemen in the fur trade. They went to live among the Algonquins, the Anishinaabe, at the upper Great Lakes. The appeal of the savage way of life, their happiness and freedom and independence, and the call of the wide open spaces saw the appearance of a new type of individual, the fur trader, who adopted the life of the Indians and succumbed to the temptations of the spirit of adventure and the spirit of discovery. As a result, French became the language of the fur trade. In 1655, in the fall of the Iroquois, simultaneously attacked the Ojibwa at various points along the Mahamushi. Runners are sent during the winter to the Ojibwe allies, the Sauk, the Foxes, the Menominee, the Kininis, Anamati, Wendat, Sandusky, and from the extreme end of the lakes appeared to the prairie of Illinois. So in 1656, the Ojibwe made a pronged attack on the Iroquois. One party routed the Iroquois on Mahamushi with minor resistance, as the Iroquois are greatly outnumbered. Those who had gone to St. Clair River had a fierce battle at the mouth of Saguenay River, and when joined by the southern Wendat, eventually overran the whole south of the peninsula. Bloodiest battles are fought on Lake Simcoe at a place called Rama, and at Mud Lake, Pigeon Lake, and Rice Lake. The last battle was fought on the mouth of the Trent River. The first encounter between the Mohawk and the Ojibwa was fought at a place called Oriella, situated about a quarter of a mile north. The Mohawk in great numbers resisted stoutly for 3 days. They finally sued for mercy that was granted. Few survivors were allowed to go to Lake Huron, where they remained during the rest of the war. The second great battle was fought on Pigeon Lake, where the Iroquois had made a strong fort. A great number of Ojibwa is killed before the fort is stormed. As a result, few Iroquois peoples were spared. The third battle is fought near Mud Lake, about 12 miles north of Peterborough. Not a male person is spared. The next day, another village at Peterborough and Smithtown is attacked, and an immense number of Iroquois people were slaughtered. The fourth village attacked is on the mouth of Watanabe on Rice Lake, where several hundreds are slain. Panic struck the Iroquois, and they assembled their remaining forces in mercy on the River of Trent. Of this army of Iroquois warriors, one alone is saved. The Iroquois are entirely broken up, and the country is subdued. The Iroquois would never again pull themselves together against the Ojibwe for they had the whole Western peoples against them. They are constantly reminded that the Ojibwe are a mighty nation who could again send a few warriors against them if they were to ever violated the peace. And knowing how the clan system works, that you don't have to be a nation in one area in one spot. If one was attacked, then the runners will go out, the canoes will go out, and the messages we defend ourselves. So the whole country is awakened to deal with that situation. And this sort of thing happened many times in oral traditions, and that's how the Anishinaabe are very strong and united when they are attacked. This could also give clues in 920 AD when the Vikings first showed up on the East Coast. And there was a story where there was these four young men that were napping along with their canoes when they were attacked by the Vikings. And they almost killed them all except for one. Now that one retreated and let the overall tribes know what's going on. And then all the nations, they sent all the runners, they sent out all the messengers, and this is what they wrote down in Icelandic saga. The whole country swarmed on them. Again, that's just the way how a nation defends themselves in a very large tract of land and territory. So in 1660, Ojibwa from the West Lake Superior, likely La Pointe, informed the French, the Goslers Party, of the geography of North America. They had shown them makeshift maps and how long of a trip to go to these places. They explained that there are 4 salt seas, one to the east, one to the north, one to the west, and one to the south. They explained that it's an 8 to 10 days journey north of Lake Superior to the Hudson Bay. They explained that the people of 60 leagues of the west of Lake Superior have been obtaining European trade goods from the Gulf of Mexico. So they've been explaining that there's trade routes, and they show them they gave them they drawn out maps for them and which areas they need to go. In 1691, the Dakota people met with Radisson and Gosler and requested an alliance to protect them from the attacks of Christinos, Woodland Cree, supported by the French. The largest tribe was the Christinan or Christianu, later shortened to the word Cree. The Woodland Cree would later be referred to as the Prairie Cree. These Cree are trading from the Hudson Bay to Sault Ste. Marie. The Dakota people who previously occupied eastern Saskatchewan, eastern Manitoba, and eastern Ontario are now divided into 3 groups. The Siouan speak in Dakota Santee, being farmers occupied semi-permanent villages along the Mississippi. Between the Mississippi and lower Missouri River were the Dakota, Laktani. Also Siouan speak in semi-mobile, but mainly hunting big game. They were the horse nations. The Assiniboine and Stoney of Canada speak the same dialect as Yucatani. Further west along the Missouri lived the Dakota Lakota, Benton, who were wholly mobile and followed the bison and buffalo. They were all untied in an informal coalition called Dakota, or just allies. But when the French explorers were going west and they were asking the Ojibwe, who lives out there? Who lives in the west? And the response was Nanadusu. Those are the snake. Now that was picked up by the French explorers by putting down Sioux. So the name stuck, which basically means those are our enemies. We don't like them. They're snakes in the grass. But the name stuck. In 1966, the history of European expansions into the area began with de Goslar and Pierre Radisson, who had pushed their way up to Lake Winnipeg. And then they went northward by the Nelson River to Hudson Bay. Their discovery was met with little interest in Lower Canada or in the court of France. But in 1670, by a royal charter from the Imperial Crown dated in May 2nd of 1670, the English, His Majesty King Charles II, King of England, incorporated certain petitioners into the governor and a company of merchant adventurers trading into the Hudson Bay. It is assumed and granted that this Hudson Bay Company, trading monopoly, setting out in the area in which it could operate, known there forever as Rupert's Land, even though the land did not belong to him or his country. So all water that eventually gets into the Hudson Bay is now being claimed as Rupert's Land to use and enjoy on the whole entire only trade and traffic, the whole and entire only liberty, use and privilege of trading to and from the territory limits foresaid and to and within natives and the people inhabiting or who inhabited within these territories, limits and places foresaid, which will be known as Rupert's Land. Essentially, they're laying claim for a very large area. So the Hudson Bay Charter asserts that their jurisdiction is over a virtual subcontinent of all the land that drain into Hudson Bay. 1.1 million square miles, or what we call 40% of modern Canada today. They are given a royal charter by Charles II, giving it the power of life and death over its subjects in the Hudson Bay in order to maintain a navy, make war, and trade monopoly in the bay forever. Rosler and Radisson, the founding fathers who made this possible, but being of lower class, are declared not fit to have a share in a new company. This English superiority towards non-English peoples have dominated the Hudson Bay Company's economic policy in the 20th century, causing much suffering for future generations to come. The Hudson Bay adventures of England conjure up an image of great explorers to the Americas. Now, the adventures of England were, however, stay-at-home investors who ventured their money into adventures in a hope of making more. In other words, they sponsor somebody to do all the exploration. Now, the Hudson Bay Company never encouraged farming near their post or started any settlement. Their total interest in the fur trade, except in the Red River in 1812 until 1869. But they primarily stayed on the coastlines. They never venture into the interior. They believe colonization and settlement distracted from the trade. The English gave the governor and company of adventurers into the Hudson Bay absolute power. It's autocracy of life or death. All people in which they consider it's their domain to pass their own laws and to enforce them. No one is to invade or settle or trade in their domain without consent of the company. The absolute feudal policy. This, in effect, is a declaration of war and in disguise of perverted formality of chivalry. This self-righteous notion of being gallant, courteous, and honorable, with a readiness to help the weak, demanded that their economic victim be regarded as a simple in nature, primitive in culture, and savage in religion. Unbeknownst to the First Nations, the English imperial shenanigans. So they have this image of themselves of imperial might, and everybody else they are the superior and everybody else is inferior. And that was going to be the attitude from there on. So there have been other companies like the Northwest companies and other companies, and there was this fierce feud. It was like declaration of war, and they went to war many times over these things during the fur trade. In 1670, the Voyageurs and Northwest companies were highly mobile group. So they are from Montreal. They travel along the Great Lakes. First Europeans to enter the regions, mention of the Assiniboine, Nakota, Saulteaux, Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, and the Cree, Ininu, or Ninuyak, or the Sioux, or Dakota, living there on interim, seasonal basis according to the availability of game. So they're talking about meeting all kinds of nations as they move west. Now the voyagers established a temporary encampment at the Forks region that later became known today as Winnipeg. The Anishinaabe rice farmers of the Red River region had been harvesting manoomin, wild rice, for ages. Their methods would remain unchanged even to modern times. Rice is to become an important trade item in the fur trade. Initially, the fur trade was mutually beneficial. The Europeans depended upon the Indian and Métis knowledge of the land and their labor and provided manufactured goods to them. So there was a good exchange going on for over 200 years as a result of a balanced trade relationship. So some historians will call this the golden age because this is about getting to know each other and also expanding westward. In 1671, the French made their first treaty with the Northwest nations at Sault Ste. Marie, the furthest west the French had penetrated with a permanent settlement. The Sault was an important commercial center, however, being the outlet of Lake Superior fur trade. Now, there is a head chief of a great Crane family of the Anishinaabe that represented the Ojibwe in the treaty. The French envoy asked in the name of the king for permission to trade in their country and for free passage to and from their villages. He asked that the fires of the French and Ojibwe nations be made as one and everlasting. The envoy told this great chief, "Every morning you will look towards the rising of the sun, and you shall see fire of your French father reflecting towards you, to warm you and your people. If you're in trouble, you and the Crane must arise in the skies and cry with your far-sounding voice, and I will hear you." So this started successions of many, many other treaties as they went westward. Like I said, it was mutually beneficial with the French nation and with the nations of Turtle Island. But also in a time of war, you can depend on each other. So in 1673, the Ojibwe in Ottawa, along with the French, controlled the fur trade. The Cree and Assiniboine forced to trade with them until the Hudson Bay Company opened up their forts at James and Hudson Bay. In 1680, some believe that at this time the Ojibwe nation began to culturally split into a northern Ojibwe, or the Saulteaux, the Great Lakes Ojibwe, and a southern Ojibwe, or Chippewa. Others contend that this natural split was evident over the last century as Ojibwe migrated westward. The Ojibwe are still acting as middlemen between the Cree and Assiniboine, who are west of Lake Superior, and the French of the St. Lawrence. Saulteaux continued to expand westward. In 1682, the Hudson Bay Company, headquartered on the Hudson Bay, Fort Nelson, was established at the mouth of nearby Nelson River. During its first century, the depot operated by drawing in the First Nations traders to the post, rather than sending out their own traders into the field. Its position at the mouth of the Nelson allowed access by canoe from watersheds of Saskatchewan and the Red Rivers. In the early 19th century, fur trading was the main industry of Western Canada. The two companies had an intense competition over the trade. The first was the Hudson Bay Company, was a London, English-based organization. And the second and the most longest is the Northwest Company, was based in Montreal. Hudson Bay Company had a distinct English in its culture and flavor, while the Northwest Company was a mixture of French, Scottish, and Indigenous cultures. But it's such a fierce, if two of them were to meet on a river, crossing each other, they'll take shots at each other. And they have known to throw in their camps, while they're sleeping in their camps, they were known to throw beehives in the midst of them while they're sleeping. That's how fierce it was. So initially, the fur trade was mutually beneficial because there was new European goods to obtain, and then you have firearms and such. The Europeans depended upon indigenous knowledge of the land and their labor, and provided manufacturers good to them. So such over 200 years, the result was a balanced relationship, a trade relationships, and it was all done by agreements called treaties. Now the fur trade brought many changes to the First Nations. So all of a sudden, it became very competitive to supply to get to the like beaver pelts. So there was now a lot of over trapping. So it created greater territorial wars and new war methods. So now there was trying to fight for territories. Disease from Europeans was showing up as smallpox, tuberculosis, and measles and all kinds of disease. Now the firewater was a new thing in trade. And those that have more experience in the East tends to disrupt their way of life through ceremonies and how people interact with each other. So that later on became an issue in terms of, and when made treaties to ensure that there will be no alcohol present in their communities. Now the missionaries showed up, the Jesuits showed up, and they brought Christianity. And all fur traders didn't like the Jesuits showing up because they interfere, and they are going to disrupt their relationship. And there was a time when they were banned from territory. So if Jesuits showed up in certain places where they're not wanted, and that's when they'll be killed because they've been told not to come into their territory. And many Indian and Métis people were faced from starvation due to overhunting and trapping. So it just changes the whole makeup, the whole territory. In 1689, the Prairie people had their first encounter with an Englishman in the field by the name of Henry Kelsey. He is after a direct trade for the Hudson Bay Company, but did not understand the trading customs that had developed over 1,000 years, the customs of the original people. He assumed the failure to trade is because of some endless warlike nature and their alliances with the French. The simple fact was that the trading ritual is a very important ceremony, if not more important than the actual trade itself. Trading is a time of gift giving, getting to know each other, exchange information, and celebrate. Have a feast, smoke your pipe. And then when that's all done, then they talk business, then they can trade. The French had learned this early when they first went up the Gulf of St. Lawrence and met the original peoples for the first time. But on the East Coast, they've been trading this way even before the French had shown up. So it's a basic standard for all the Anishinaabe people in Turtle Island. In 1990, the governor of the Hudson Bay Company officially sent Henry Kelsey and an apprentice clerk at age 23, who was an apprentice clerk, and Thomas Savage to the Churchill River to build that trading post. Well, Thomas Savage was building the fort. Henry Kelsey and an Indian companions went out to publicize the fort, the post among the Indians. They went out and explored, and they penetrated to the backcountry some 140 miles as they went south and west. Now Kelsey on August of 1690, deserted. He just outright deserted the Hudson Bay Company because he could not stand the company's indifference towards exploring the interior of the country. He took a native wife and an English, and the English assured him to be the first Englishman to see the broad Canadian prairies. So he was the first Englishman to go into that exploration. And they traveled with the stone, and probably this is the Grouse venture, but they were both members of the Blackfoot Confederation. So he was able to travel west into those territories. He traveled to Paul across the Saskatchewan and the Red Rivers, and possibly went as far as the Torchwood Hills. Some contend he made it to central Alberta and built a log cabin on the Red Deer River. He would eventually return back to the Hudson Bay Company by 1692, and he was accepted back to its employ. The Hudson Bay Company disapproved of cohabitance with natives, and was reluctant to allow Henry Kelsey's Cree wife in the fort when he returned. It's questionable if this can be claimed as an exploration of the Hudson Bay Company, because Kelsey had left his employment when he explored into the west. So he wasn't a member of the Hudson Bay Company when he did this. Now the English would not authorize that inland exploration, but was very quick to claim the credit for Henry Kelsey's unauthorized exploration. So this was a strange policy, considering they would claim to own all the Northwest lands now. Not only do they claim Rupert's land, now they're trying to say they claim all the Northwest lands. Later on, you'll see those names on those maps that were created by the English. But throughout 1700s, and they came in many waves. The infectious disease such as smallpox had a devastating toll on the Indian population in Canada. So waves throughout the century, epidemics disseminated the nations. And experts today say it was as high as 95% of the population that crippled these societies and their economies. And they destroyed their societies, and they did leave a haunting ghost camps in its wake. So it was reported that many villages had bones, and so they call them ghost camps. It was at this time the origin of the medicine society, the Midday Society, began, especially when their knowledge of how to treat disease, distress, and death that had entered on Turtle Island. The Great Spirit has spoken to the Anishinaabe by saying, "There is not a flower that buds, however small, that is not for some wise purpose. There is not a blade of grass, however insignificant, that the Anishinaabe does not require. Learning this and acting according to these truths will work out your own good, will please the Great Spirit." So this medicine society would become involved in all future negotiations with the peoples and the Europeans. But the knowledge of medicine is tremendous, and they were able to survive a lot of these infectious disease. And other nations want that from them, that knowledge from them. Like the Cree later on would say, "We would like you to come and live with us, because you have the knowledge of medicine. And plus, you're great defenders of your own land as warriors." In 1701, the Great Peace of Montreal was formulated. It was a peace treaty that represented more than 20 Anishinaabe nations that assembled in Montreal for peace negotiations. That was sponsored by the French governor of France. Now, the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy and the Iroquois Confederacy promised to live in peace after 100 years of conflict. The Great Circle of Peace was made on August 4 in 1701, and it had 1,200 representatives of 40 First Nations that had entered into this peace treaty to remain neutral in any future conflict between the English and French. It also opened up the country so that you don't have to enter treaty all the time or fight over territories. So that brought the great peace to much of North America. Now the French are just beginning to appreciate the vast country and how immense it really is. The French explorers started going deeper into the interior. This brought years of economic harmony and wealth and mutual respect and commitment by the French, alone among the European colonists of North America, not to exterminate or enslave indigenous people, but to become allies. The chiefs signed with Dominic their totem marks, images and animals and birds of their clans in a lot of these agreements. Historians today believe this is the time that modern Canada was starting to develop, it was starting to take shape. There are over 70 historical treaties that was negotiated with the First Nations between 1701 and 1923 in Canada. And the majority were the Anishinaabe people. The tribes of these regions had been trading through Cree and Assiniboine middlemen with English posts on the Hudson Bay since the late 1600s. The initial contact between First Nations people and the Europeans at the Forks occurred in the 1720s and the 1730s. French fur traders were pushing beyond the Great Lakes Basin in pursuit of new trading opportunities to look for the Western Sea. They hoped would be a shortcut to the East Indies, to the Eastern trade companies they have on Vancouver Island, but turned out to be Lake Winnipeg, where when they were told of the great vast water. At the same time, the Cree and Assiniboine were restructuring their alliances and were beginning to move into new territories further west. The Ojibwe began a similar process later in the century. As part of a resource-rich transition zone between the parkland and prairies, the Forks was a natural focal point for communities to meet peacefully and to compete for resources. In 1763, Pierre Ladrevondier was involved in the quest to find this route to the Pacific, what is known as the Northwest Passage. And he met with a Cree guide who made a map of a canoe route between Lake Superior to Lake Winnipeg. In 1770, many Ojibwe from Sault Ste. Marie, Grand Portage, and La Pointe marched against the Dakotas to secure Sandy Lake, or Lake of the Sandy Waters. It is from Sandy Lake that the Ojibwe secured Leech and Winnipeg, Cass, and Red and Gull and Crow Wing lakes for their fur trade. The Ojibwa believed that the Gros Ventres were the men of the olden times that had occupied this region before the Dakota. The Gros Ventres tradition suggests they once lived in the mouth of the Savannah River near Sandy Lake. The Gros Ventres were noted to be culturally aligned with the Mandans. And the Mandans were a mysterious tribe because they were agriculture, then they fortified themselves with walls, and they made they say they made alcohol like beer, and they were pot-bellied and they had color red in their hair and beards. But you know, why does the Minnesota have a team called Vikings? And then they have these runes that have their symbols on rocks. So there is a possibility that they could have been the lost colony from the East Coast that found their way up through the Hudson Bay into the Red River and moved forward into these parts. In 1729, the Lake of the Woods Cree carried gifts to the Ojibwe and La Pointe to effect a peace treaty, and requesting an alliance against the Dakota were also in this area. They already made alliances, the Cree has made alliances with the Assiniboine, who happened to break away from their brothers, the Dakota. So they are now allies. And that's where the name Assiniboine name is after the people who cook with stones, the Assiniboine, the stone people. But now they're reaching out to the Ojibwe as the Ojibwe expands westward. They're looking for their protection as warrior society, but also for their knowledge of medicines to deal with the lot of their people are dying in great numbers from smallpox. In 1730, Hudson Bay Company reported that the first Ojibwa traders at their forts on the Hudson Bay. Ojibwa had joined the Cree and Assiniboine in their northern trade journey to the Hudson Bay. The Assiniboine had been trading for many years with the English. In 1734, one of the Lauderdale sons of Jean Baptiste established Fort Maurepas on the site, approximately 14 miles upstream from the mouth of the Red River. Fort Maurepas is important historically as being the first post in the area trying to capture the fur trade and to make allies with the local natives, which included the Cree, the Assiniboine, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Métis, and other traders. It was at this time, as they established their forts and into their areas, there's a lot of fur traders from the east, and a lot of them were Corabras, or later on the licensed ones were called the voyageurs, started intermarrying locally, and the birth of the started in the later on birth of the Red River de Métis started forming. 1736, the Cree and the Assiniboine encouraged the French to build trading posts at the Assiniboine and Red River to secure their southern limits of their territory. It would also limit the northward expansion of the Dakota Sioux and destroy the French-Dakota alliance. La Javonier's eldest son built a fort in the junction of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers, and it was the site of a favorite First Nations gathering encampment called the Gathering Place. He built the first fur trade called Fort Rouge and what is called Le Fort or the Forks. Lauderdale said that to be the first Europeans to see what is now called Winnipeg, or dirty water, is the most common way of describing it. Later on, it was named the Red River. This particular post at the Forks was occupied only for a very brief time because it tends to flood quite a bit every spring. And that's where I'm going to leave it. I leave it with this map because that's where most linguist experts have frozen the picture. They've frozen this picture showing where did everybody ended up being. Like I said in my previous session of the Anishinaabeg migration of going along the Great Lakes and then continuing on to the other lakes like Lake Winnipeg and Lake Manitoba, but they continue on going to the Rocky Mountains. So this picture you see here, that is green, is what a linguist expert will call the Algonquin linguist group, which is quite ancient. But in our language, in our how we define this is we are all Anishinaabe because we all came from the original human being, and we are placed here on Turtle Island. We're meant to be here. But all these other events that I've been talking to you about is only recent events by oral tradition since the time of the last flood. So this is where we are now. So when I start talking about the rest of the history, we're going to talk about European relationships and how treaties were made. And the big one is the Royal Proclamation of 1763. But later on, we'll be focusing on the history around these parts in the heart of Turtle Island. And it'll lead up to the events into treaties of Treaty 1 and 2. And then we'll talk about the rest of the history. So I want to say, this is where I pause, and this is where I'll stop the share. And this is where my colleague, my good friend, Rennie McGurry, did you have any questions for me?
Not a lot, because it was basically just a timeline of when things happened. I still really am puzzled by the names of First Nations groups, you know, how they change from Chippewa to Ojibwe, you know, and all the different names, you know, and how we're changing the names now to Anishinaabe and so on. I don't know where those English names came from.
It's not changing back to, it was always Anishinaabe. It's just that
Yeah.
over time, the language expanded outwards. So now you're gonna have the Blackfoot. Now you're gonna have Cree. Now you're gonna have Shawnee. So over since ancient times, the language evolves.
Oh, okay.
The recent dialects that we know of, say Saulteaux, is a recent oral tradition that says that's what the French named us when they met up with us.
Well, yeah.
And so we were called the Northern Ojibwe.
Yeah.
But really, the name stuck in terms of Saulteaux as we move westward.
Right.
The Northern Ojibwe ended up going down again to La Pointe. Now the same name, Ojibwe, is come from Chippewa, Ojibwa. So a Chippewa,
Oh,
a Chippewa. So the more south you are, the more east you are, you tend to have that kind of a description. But it's basically renaming everybody over and over again.
yeah.
So it's just, so it depends on your territory and how you want to be named. Controversy today was people says, well, we're Anishinaabe, and I say yes, but there are 5 ways to describe that about us. It's
Yeah.
like there are 7 dialects of the Cree,
Oh, okay.
so they might call themselves Innu of
Yeah.
the first people. But because they're vast, expanding throughout the north, you got the woodland Cree, you got the swampy Cree, you got the plains Cree, and you got OG Cree. So how can you really get mad at anybody that want to call themselves OG Cree?
Yeah.
Because that's how they evolved into. Now, if you were to really break it down and say it right, you would say Ojibwe Cree, but they cut it. They said OG Cree.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. They want to call themselves that, even though in Anishinaabe, when OG means fly. But who are we to criticize that? Now, the controversy today in our Treaty 2 territory is that, do we continue on to call ourselves Saulteaux? And do we call ourselves
Yeah.
Ojibwe? Well, as a historian, I know their migration route. I know the history. That's what this presentation is about.
Yeah.
What ended up being growing up is that my grandfather spoke Saulteaux. He told me that.
Yeah.
And he says, what do you call ourselves? What do you call it? What kind of Indian are we? Saulteaux. I never heard of Ojibwe until I left my community.
Right.
And it's basically the same people.
Yeah.
Now, the ones that are very traditional, they hit you hard and says, don't call yourself Saulteaux or don't call yourselves Ojibwe. Those are colonization names.
Yeah.
Well, really, it's historical names where they have different sources. Now, Ojibwe has many meanings, and the one that I like, and I have it. I don't have it in front of me. Is essentially Bree is like a lot of our language is Ode, heart. We describe ourselves as people of the heart, but Bre is breath. So that's living. A human being that lives with his heart. That is the ancient way of describing Ojibwe, Bray is breath.
Oh, okay.
And that's what once I said it. Or you can pick the one where you can say that the Dakota hated us so much that they named us. As when you when you burn them at the stake, they sound like they're roasting and they pop. Roasted. I'm not going to accept that as a description. We'll never allow our enemies to name us that way. And they're saying the way other people describe us is the way we shape our moccasins.
Yeah.
Well, they're just describing this is the Ojibwe way and how they make their moccasins. That's not our name.
Yeah.
Puckered moccasins. So
Yeah.
anyway, I'm more tend to believe that it has to be based on the teachings of as a human being, and we breathe. That's life. So
Yeah.
stay tuned. I'm gonna finalize that eventually.
Yeah. Well, I have lots of questions about names, like even people's family names, right? Like Sutherland. Did that come
Well,
from?
I don't have any questions about that. I know exactly where it came from,
Yeah.
and it came with the Lord Selkirk settlers. You can see the names of all the settlers on Peguis Trail on that bridge.
Right.
McKays, you know, it's Sutherlands in there. Now they do have a manifest on who came
Right.
from Scotland. So that's how the name came from, because Scotland is a clan system too. So there was a Sutherland clan family that came here. But
All right.
when Roy Hawkins did a genealogy of the Sutherland name, the Sutherland name was all over North America, like Montreal.
Yeah.
It wasn't just St. Andrews here in the Red River.
Yeah.
It could be traced all the way from France, because at one time they were both one country. King and queen had both English and French
Yeah.
conquest. But the intermarriage of Sutherland name goes even to France in the 1500s. So if
What
you want to look at the names, it's easy to track European names.
the European ones? Yeah. But
But
what
you
about
you're never gonna track the names of our own people that are
okay.
named like Nipanak. I'm Nipanak.
Yeah.
Nipanak is a way, it was when we, Baptiste Nipanak is my ancestor who spoke French, because we had French
Okay.
forts in our communities. But when Roy Hawkins tried his best to find out where did he come from, well, Saint Laurent is as far back he can get,
Yeah.
because people were named like with me, Washki is my spirit name. So it's hard to hand that over to the next family member
Okay.
unless you
Yeah.
kept calling yourselves White Spotted Horse.
Yeah.
So it was impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder about names like Blackbird. Is that trans?
English, it ended up being frozen, just like by the time you got the if you ever look at treaty payments, they were the original names.
Yeah.
Eventually Catchaway is more like an ancient description of those that came over the mountain, like Riding Mountain. And
Yeah.
then later on, it became more English, as English you can get it. Just like Nipanak is Summer Bear.
Yeah.
So it ended up being a English form of that Summer Bear description. Catchaway, more of that description. So eventually they'll have to say Nipanak, Catchaway, and it froze. That's how it's going to be from the descendants onwards. Same thing with Blackbird.
Yeah.
An ancestor wrote it down in treaty payment, and it stayed that way, and then all the descendants after that. St.
Okay.
Teresa Point is interesting because a lot of them has Woodhouse or Stephenson, or because they had only these white traders, like they own a store in St. Teresa Point. So there was
Yeah.
only a couple of white people there. So in treaty payments, they says you got to change your name. They changed everybody on that day. So everybody
Oh,
pretty well became a Woodhouse.
okay.
So that maybe that's where your connection is.
Yeah, it
A
could
white man
very well.
trader.
Yeah, yeah. It's just like there's the name Two Hearts. Someone told me there was a story about it being a way of describing twins.
Yeah, and it would be that kind of description.
Yeah. So it became Two Hearts. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we have this humor, like the first black man that came to the Red River during the fur trade, and they called him. They kept on. They nicknamed him. They gave him his name. They call him Wapchki, this black trader,
Yeah.
which means white.
Oh, which means white. What?
But that's the humor.
Oh. Oh boy. Well, that's a whole nother session talking about names.
Yeah, and yeah, it's just that like I couldn't say the names that were in my presentation because first of all I don't know the meaning, and I don't know how
Yeah.
to say it.
Yeah.
So you have to find somebody who has that ancient knowledge of that language. We call
Yeah.
that ceremony language.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and when I looked at our original signatories of 1871, Treaty 1 and 2, they were named by their spirit name with an English name.
Okay.
So what I would ask them, some is obvious, and like bird feather, like that's easy. But then there are those that are hard. Then I'll ask my language people, what are they trying to say here?
Yeah.
And we have to put our heads together because one will help the other out, and then we all have a consensus. That's what they meant.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Very interesting. I don't have any more questions. I just had thoughts.
All right, that's good because that's what this is all about. Bring you more. You have more questions for yourself.
Yeah.
More thinking to do.
More thinking to do.
All right. Well, we'll end it right here
Okay.
until next week.
Yeah.
Well, different time maybe, but next week we'll get the next session going.
Okay.
Talk to you later.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Oh, okay.